Hi everyone, welcome to week 6 of Globalisation since 1945. This week we are discussing Bernardine Evaristo's Girl, Woman, Other and Johny Pitts' Afropean. As you can see, I'm in my office. I'm just we'll be starting we'll be starting the discussion, the in-class discussion over Zoom soon. I'm really looking forward to what people have to say about these two well, it's so hard not to editorialize these two incredible books. And I'm really looking forward to how the discussion is going to go in terms of, the larger sort of issue of reading works of literature in a history class. And of course, there'll be a lot more to say about that. Let's take a look outside at the weather. As always, I'll pick up the conversation on my walk home, based on I have a couple of ideas. Let's see, it's looking pretty cloudy, but that's okay. Hopefully it won't rain. And even if it does, that's okay too. I think I'll walk along the canal, which might be a little nice on the way home. And I've got a couple of ideas of maybe one or two things I might want to mention, but I'm hoping to pick up some things from the conversation in class, and an idea or two I have actually building on some of the great points that have already been made from the distance learning students and on the discussion boards online as well. Okay, class is about to start soon, so I will see you all afterwards on my walk home. More shortly. Okay, hi everybody. Just finished class. Really great conversation, as it always is. Very quick, as it always is. I have a little bit more daylight now, which is nice. So I'm going to take the canal, but there's some construction going on over by the train station, which is one place where I might enter the canal. And it sounds like I can hear from here. I just could a minute ago. It's really noisy, so I'll go this way and get on the canal and make my way that way. Okay, so discussion then again of Johny Pitts' Afropean and Bernardine Evaristo's Girl, Woman, Other. Two wonderful works of literature, two very different works of literature, and works that shed light in different ways on the practice of history, on the way that that we're thinking about topics in this module, and many other things. Okay, so I guess what I want to do, okay, I made a couple of notes. Let me just make sure I bring some order to my remarks here to kind of try to continue the conversation from class. So, and not just from class, but also with the distance learning students from the discussion boards as well. So I'm going to start by just reiterating a couple of really important points that were made in class and on the discussion boards. From there, I'd like to say a little bit about my experiences with how I feel like literature has been useful for me for thinking about history or thinking as a historian. I'll try to say a little bit about some works of literature that might connect to some topics in history, topics that are of interest to me, and also topics that are those that we've been looking at in this class on global history since 1945. And then maybe at the end I'll say a little bit about, I was just trying to think about what novel has, one novel maybe in particular that's really influenced my own thinking as a historian and as a person. I mean, I guess I would start by saying that Afropean and Girl, Woman, Other have really influenced my thinking as a historian and as a person. It's hard to imagine not being moved by both of these works, and I feel like in the room just now, the room virtually that is, that many people felt this as well. So that's great. Okay, so a couple of points that were raised in the discussion today. So I'll start with something that was said in class, which is this idea that the people sometimes get lost in the academic reading that we do. I think that's such a great point and such a good place to start to sort of continue to think about the work of literature and history. And, we're interested, as we talked about in class today, and not just historians, but many academics are interested in the relationship between structure and agency. We know about structures of oppression, domination, resistance, privilege, and that individuals obviously live within and in relation to these structures. We sometimes think, though, about the individual as a unit, and something that literature can enable us to do, and we can think about this in terms of, very much in terms of Bernardine Evaristo's characters, as well as the individuals who Johny Pitts meets along the way in his travels through Europe. And this is to think about the ways that we're unique individuals as human beings, our idiosyncrasies, the things about us that are likable, the quirks, the things about us that are not likable, the ways in which our mistakes and wrong thinking can hurt others, can be damaging to ourselves. Are we redeemable? There's just so many different, obviously, all the complexities of being a person come out in these works. Maybe particularly just given the nature of the book and Girl, Woman, Other here. And so this is immediately one thing that that historians can think more deeply with by reading literature than only by sticking to the academic production. Of course, it goes without saying, as important as it is within our own discipline. Another point that was made was that this idea, this was from the discussion boards, one of the distance learning students raised, the idea that fiction does not make learning less real. Okay, this is great. There's a way we might think about, history is the actual stuff that happened, and literature is mere stories. And of course, as has already been pointed out by students in this class, in both in class and through distance learning, that of course learning fiction is itself descriptions of kinds of reality. There's always going to be some kind of remove between the author and the thing that's being written about, and this can be through the work of imagination in terms of literature, and also the kind of the different kind of work of imagination that travel writing is, and then also, of course, no historian is describing or arguing about historical events that anyone can fully experience again, and especially if it's further back in time. So it's also interesting to think about literature as as real, as well as works of history. A couple other points too that were raised on the discussion boards. One was around literature as a gateway into a topic. That's such a nice way of thinking about, if you have something you're interested in. And this was also raised in class too, that both of the books that we read this week, they were really good ways into topics to think about. And they might be topics that we've thought about before, the relationship between race, class, and gender in the UK and in Europe more broadly and at the global level. But there's also a kind of opening that literature allows into topics that does a certain, that offers a certain kind of invitation that formally academic work maybe doesn't, at least not in the same way. And finally, someone else raised the point about historians ourselves as storytellers, which is, of course, in many ways what we are. Speaking for myself, not necessarily with the ability to convey things in a literary manner, but nonetheless, telling stories is an important part of what we do. So I'd like to connect that point to some broader kind of thinking here. So these are just points I'm taking from what students have said, and to build on this a little bit in terms of the storytelling point, this made me think of three individuals. Hayden White, historian and kind of theorist of history writing. His book Meta History from 1973, maybe 74. In Meta History, he argues, or he explores this kind of idea of history writing as the influence of literature on history writing. And he has this concept of emplotment, and that historians write in different modes that are kind of storytelling modes of emplotment. We tell a plot, we tell a story. This is not an empiricist endeavor in which we objectively take information from archives and scientifically prove points. Obviously, we have to convey the information that we have through writing, through narrative, and therefore we are already engaged in a kind of literary practice as it is, even though, again, again, speaking for myself, not necessarily with the flair and the ingenuity that authors in literature are capable of. Okay, Thomas King, the Cherokee essayist, critic, and theorist, also came to mind here as someone who's written about the power of stories. He has an essay collection called The Truth About Stories, and there King writes about, I mean, in the way that he does, he writes about indigenous history and politics and culture, representations of indigenous people in white, Canadian and US contexts. And he writes about how stories are central and powerful to all of these things, both in the ways that they can, tell stories in the interest of liberation, but also the ways that dangerous stories can can perpetuate stereotypes, and can be, obviously, storytelling can be very significant in terms of oppression as well. So King comes to mind here. And thirdly, as does Leslie Marmon Silko, the essayist and novelist, Laguna Pueblo essayist and novelist, who I'm going to come back to at the end with an example of a novel that has one of her novels has really impacted my thinking. Okay, but before that, I wanted to say a little bit more about the impact of literature in terms of the ways that it can the ways that literature can interact with other disciplines, or even in an everyday kind of sense. I was thinking about when I first moved to Birmingham. I wanted to know a bit about the history. I knew a tiny bit, but I wanted to know more about the history of the city. And so I turned to the work of Simon Nassar, historians Simon Nassar, and my colleague Gavin Schaffer, writing about the pub bombings of 1974 that happened here that I had heard of. I didn't know too much about them. And so I was able to learn a lot from their work and the oral history work that they also have done in terms of talking about this event, talking about what it meant for the city, writing about what it meant for people of Irish descent in Birmingham, and I learned a lot from them. I also, not long after I moved here, read Jonathan Coe's novel The Rotters Club, which I'm sure many of you know, and it tells, it's about Birmingham in the 70s, and there's music, and this kind of the shift from, we might say the shift from, to put it in one way, from Fordism to flexible accumulation, the shift to Thatcherism, and it really significantly tells the story of the pub bombings, and it does it, of course, through characters in a novel, and it just is so powerful, and it made me feel like I understood the history of this city better by reading all three of these authors, by reading Nassar and Schaffer and reading Coe as well. So this was sort of it's not quite an everyday example, but one example of how literature can inform historical thinking. For me also, I work at a university, and so a big institution with a big bureaucracy, and there's a lot that's been written about bureaucracy. And when we think about theorization of bureaucracy, often the first thinker that comes to mind is the German sociologist Max Weber, who wrote about bureaucracy as part of modernity, the tendency for bureaucracies to expand, to become an iron cage, and so on. I've learned from Weber on bureaucracy, but I would say I've learned more from Franz Kafka about bureaucracy. The Castle and the Trial get at the absurdity of bureaucracy in ways that connect, I think, still, 100 years later after his works were written, more than 100 years now, I guess, they connect to the everyday experience today of bureaucracies in the 21st century. And then another everyday kind of example that I was thinking about here is, as you know, as you can see me doing right now, I like to walk. I'm a pedestrian, and I was thinking about, you know, some of the great pedestrian novels. Teju Cole's Every Day is for the Thief, about his experiences and travels in Lagos, in Nigeria, and Open City, about New York. Well, not necessarily his, but the character, at least, that is central in these two novels. I was also thinking about W.G. Sebald's Austerlitz, about the story of a character who was brought to Wales as a young child, from Czechoslovakia in the kinder transports, and the ways that the characters walk around in those novels are essential to it helps me to understand walking better. It helps me to think about the relationship between reading and experience and walking. So again, every day, but nonetheless, I think kind of profound too, at least for me. Okay, turning to more larger subjects then, I wanted to think about some larger topics that are of interest to me, that we've been talking about somewhat in this class, and that can very much be explored, and I would say kind of must be explored through literature. So with a class that looks at global history since World War II, I thought World War II, or war even, is one place to start, and one place where I think people know and will have their own examples, you know, All Quiet on the Western Front and other classics here. Again, the ways that they can deepen our understanding of this topic. So I was thinking, I picked out a few examples as I was trying to think of some that have been useful for me. Anne Michael's Fugitive Pieces, which is about a Jewish Polish child who manages to get away from the Nazis, survives with the help of an adult in Greece. Ultimately, the story winds up later in Canada, and the descriptions of wartime, you know, also through a child's eyes in parts of the story, they're just kind of unforgettable. There's descriptions of Warsaw after the uprising in 1944, and just the kind of rubble. There's a line, I'm not going to get it right, but it's something like, as though all of the stone had been lifted into the sky and dropped and shattered into an endless number of pieces or something. It makes you think about conflict and war in a different way. David Al-Bahari's Götzenmeier is also another very powerful. It's a novel about two German soldiers who are assigned the duty of driving a truck in Yugoslavia, driving a truck in which Jewish people are murdered through asphyxiation in the back of this truck as they're transported. And the mundane sort of nature of this from the perspective of the two characters that are described, and then the way that the narrator of the novel sort of begins to, in some ways, kind of break down in the course of telling this story, is at once gives us a sense of, you know, description of perpetrators and of victims and of the legacies for families of victims of some of course, the worst atrocities and war crimes of World War II. David Benioff's City of Thieves is another novel that I like. It's about the siege of Leningrad and these two youngsters they're like teenagers who are given the task of finding a dozen eggs amid the siege, as a way of being able to they're assigned this task by someone in the secret police, and they don't really have much of a choice. They have to carry it out, and their adventures through the city just is another way of thinking about the siege, which the siege of Leningrad is something, you know, you can read about it, you know how awful it was, how long it was, so many people died, the deprivations were intense and immense. But again, literature can bring us into what that world might have been like in ways that other works, that other kinds of writing, again, I keep saying the same point, but this is the point, that other kinds of writing do in different ways and don't do in the way that the literature does. A different war, but another, I think, essential book about war is Viet Thanh Nguyen's The Sympathizer. This is about the U.S. war against Vietnam, and it's about a character, the sympathizer. He can sort of see multiple sides of any kind of situation, and he comes to the United States at the end of the U.S. war in Vietnam in 1975. The plot unfolds from there, but it's brilliant at you know, it kind of begins after the war. It's brilliant at thinking about the war, but it's also really interesting in terms of thinking about representations of the war. The novel itself engages with the very question of representation in the war and how the war has been depicted, namely in Hollywood, maybe more specifically in the film Apocalypse Now. The Cold War, connected here, is of course something that we've been talking about. We had a whole week on it in this module, and John le Carré's The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, of course, comes to mind here. It's from the mid-60s. And it's very good at showing, you know, particularly at that time when the idea of the Iron Curtain and the Berlin Wall was meant to demarcate two very clearly different sort of territories from the Western point of view, the territory of freedom and the territory of totalitarianism. And Le Carré obviously shows the impossibility of that way of thinking, and shows the betrayals and the compromised sort of politics of both sides. Laura Prescott's book, The Secrets We Kept, I read a couple years ago. It's pretty new. It's on it's about the novel Dr. Zhivago and Pasternak's Dr. Zhivago, and how the CIA saw in this book, written in the Soviet Union, subversive of the Stalinist ideology in the post-Stalinist years of the Khrushchev thaw, saw an opportunity to undermine the Soviet Union, and so really engaged in a program of, you know, getting this novel out and getting it published and circulated. And it's good at showing the kind of U.S. culture of this as well, and the gender politics of working in an office in the United States, and other kinds of again, things that might get left out of a history account of the Cold War. And I should say, you know, thinking about the GDR, since our week on the Cold War focused quite specifically on the German Democratic Republic, I thought of Eugen Ruge's In Times of Fading Light, which is a sort of multi-generational family story set in the GDR. Well, set mostly in the GDR. A little bit of it is in Mexico, and how different generations experienced the GDR, which is quite interesting to think about in relation to Ned Richardson Little's book, which also covers, you know, the GDR throughout its history, and to think about how it was sort of understood by different generations, and how, of course, the proximity to the World War II experience also really shaped the thinking of communists within the GDR and what they were trying to achieve. Fiona Ringtoul's The Leipzig Affair is another great novel set in the GDR. This one's set in the 1980s, and it's about a Scottish PhD student who is studying in East Germany, in Leipzig, and has a romance with an East German young woman who wants to escape from the GDR. I should pause here for a second. I know everyone in Birmingham will know where I am, but if you haven't been here before, this is a kind of a cool tunnel, the Edgbaston Tunnel along the walk. There's a bike coming here, so maybe I'll wait till it comes out, and then I'll make my way through. So yeah, the Leipzig affair is also great in terms of also kind of a story of betrayals and about the Stasi and its ever-present role in East German society. Okay, turning to a few other topics here that we might think about, big historical topics that works of literature speak to, and again, I'm gonna argue in essential ways. I'll put it strongly because I feel strongly about it. Our knowledge, literature is not an enhancement to our knowledge. Literature is essential to our knowledge of these topics. And as someone else raised in the conversation in class today, of course, this doesn't mean that all literature does this equally. The varied quality of works of literature enable it to, in powerful and less powerful and maybe actually unhelpful ways, speak to the topics that they speak to. Just like works of history can also be deeply flawed or, brilliant. Of course, this is important to keep in mind with literature. I'm pointing to examples that I think are excellent, brilliant indeed, to make the point that I want to make, but I also feel like it's useful to think about how literature can lead us astray, of course, as well, just like other kinds of writing and other kinds of modes of representation can too. Thinking ahead, think about this with film, which we'll be coming to next time. Okay, so thinking about topics related to race, which we've also been talking about in this class, I have to start here with some of the fictional and literary representations of slavery, because again, I've mentioned a couple of works that pertain to the Holocaust. And again, I think when you're dealing with something of the scope and horror, just let this person by. No problem. When you're dealing with something of the scope and horror of something like the Holocaust or slavery, literature can be all the more important for helping us to come to terms with the topic. And on slavery, I mean, there are many examples we can point to, but Octavia Butler's Kindred, Toni Morrison's Beloved, and Colson Whitehead's The Underground Railroad all came quickly to my mind. Butler's science fiction account of time travel, it was published in the late 70s. A person in the contemporary, an African American woman in the present of the 1970s, is pulled back into the era of antebellum slavery, well, there's a lot to say, but I'll leave it at that. And it the jarring back and forth that happens between the two time periods also just does something in terms of the treatment of the topic. And it also, as is true with both of the other books, it also, like in Beloved and in The Underground Railroad, also says something about how science fiction is I guess we could say an innovative way into the topic, but in many ways a very necessary way. This topic is the horrors of this topic are beyond the bounds of regular just sort of sensory perception in some ways. And so, and you see this, of course, in Toni Morrison's Beloved, which is, as I'm sure some of you know, connected to a true story, the story of Margaret Gardner in history in the antebellum era. And Colson Whitehead's The Underground Railroad, which, in fantastical form has the Underground Railroad as an actual railroad underground, is just, again, literary scholars would be much better able to talk about this than me. But to my mind, again, it sort of suggests something about the sensory, about the transgression of sensory bounds or something that slavery, the insult to human dignity that slavery represented. Also connected to race, of course, decolonization is something that we're really talking about in this module too. We have already with some of our readings, and a few examples here that may be familiar to some of you. Peter Abrahams, the South African novelist Peter Abrahams' Arif Rudomo is from the 1950s. It was published in 1956, and it's kind of a fictionalized account of the road to independence for, well, I think it's kind of a fictionalized account of Ghana. And but it's written, what's so interesting about it is it's written in the moment when it's a fictionalized account of this era of now history, but written as this history was unfolding. And, you know, really powerfully explores issues of nation building in the context of multiple ethnicities in nations, in colonies becoming post-colonial nations whose very, you know, boundaries and borders were drawn by the imperialist powers, and so on. Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children is, of course, a big, major, influential work from the 1980s on the independence of India and Pakistan. Again, also, you know, with definitely science fiction kinds of characteristics to it as well, with the characters having, you know, of course, various intensity of superpower based on their proximity to the coming into existence of independent India and Pakistan in 1947. I also thought here of Dion Brand's At the Full Unchange of the Moon, which is not, you might not think of it typically as a novel of decolonization, but I think it connects to, there's an opening scene of a form of kind of mass revolt among the enslaved, and then the novel from there follows characters into more contemporary times. It opens in Trinidad in the times of slavery, and you know, this kind of, I guess I would suggest that this kind of revolt that the opening of the novel kind of begins with connects slavery to colonialism, which of course they're closely connected, but also connects these longer histories of resistance of the enslaved to anti-colonialism, which, you know, becomes formal decolonization, as we've talked about in the years after World War II. Race and immigration are also, I know these are topics of interest to many of you, and they come up in different ways, of course, in the two books that we've read, in Afropean and in Girl, Woman, Other, that we looked at this week as well. Some further ones I'd add to the list. Upton Sinclair's 1906 classic, The Jungle, which is about immigration from Eastern Europe to the United States in the era of kind of mass immigration from Europe, particularly by then Eastern Europe, through Ellis Island, and the experiences that the main family in that book is from Lithuania, and the experiences that awaited them in Chicago, including in work in the meatpacking plants. The descriptions of working in meatpacking plants in Chicago in the winter in the early 20th century are unforgettable, and they teach us a lot about work, politics, immigration, and even race in the Gilded Age as well. With shortcomings, again, I think this is making me think of the point I mentioned a minute ago that one of the students raised in class about how you know, the novels don't always get with equal quality the different kinds of topics, and so with Sinclair, there's clearly questions to be asked around the sympathy for Eastern European immigrants, maybe in juxtaposition to the books. Just gonna wait a sec for someone to come through here. The books, I would say maybe less skillful handling. That's maybe one way, maybe it's maybe one generous way of putting it, of thinking about anti-black racism in the United, which was, of course, I mean, this is in the era, this is the nadir and segregation in the United States, in Chicago as well. So again, we can think about limitations as well as insights in the various works that we're talking about. What else? I had a couple more. Oh yeah, Samuel Selvon's The Lonely Londoners is a 50s classic, which is mentioned, which Bernardino, one of the characters, mentions as a male-centered novel, which indeed it is. It's also an important classic about the experience of the Windrush generation in Britain in the 1950s as well. Andrea Levy's Small Island, which has been made into a film. I haven't seen the film yet, but the novel is tremendous, and is so good at again giving us insight into thinking about the immigration experience into the UK after World War II, but also thinking about white racism and white British racism as well, which is obviously very important to that story. And Small Island does a very good job of this. And even just the name of the book, we mentioned this in class, that the ways in which novels can have arguments, even though they don't necessarily state them in the same way that history books do. I think with Small Island, we might say that there's an argument in Levy's very title. And a book, another book from a Canadian author, Katja Rudolph's Little Bastards in Springtime is an account of a teenager who comes from the former Yugoslavia and experienced the wars, that in the era of Slobodan Milosevic, and then comes to Canada, lives in Toronto, and is very shaped by the trauma that this person faced. And this is another thing, that the topic of trauma is a big one for many of the topics that we're looking at, and literature can give us an angle of vision, a unique angle of vision on that topic as well. Okay, one more topic I was thinking of, because I know it's another one that we're dealing with in the module, and that's the environment, the Anthropocene, we might say. And a couple that came to mind here, both science fiction works, were N.K. Jesmond's The Fifth Season and Kim Stanley Robinson's New York 2140. The Fifth Season is hard. I mean, I will not get a job as a ad copywriter for novelists, or to be an agent of a novelist, because my skills at describing these novels, as you can see, are not the greatest. The Fifth Season is a fantasy science fiction about a continent. It's completely fantasy. It's not Earth, and in which different sort of categories of people perform different jobs. Some of them, to our thinking, very supernatural, that involve earthquakes and using kind of the force of the earth in different power surges. And what I want to say about this is, and this is happening in a society that's kind of experiencing a moment of great climate change. So here's the connection to what we're working on in class. But what it also does, which is so important, is it looks at the way that climate crisis is, it doesn't affect all human beings equally. Of course, in society structured in racial dominance, we see this. We see this with the coronavirus. We see this with climate change. We see who pays the greater, consequences of climate change, which is caused not equally by humans as well. So race would be a category of analysis essential to thinking about climate change. Let's put it that way. And if that's the case, and I would argue very strongly that it is, that Jemisin's The Fifth Season is a really interesting way to think about that in a kind of racially ordered society, in a world of fantasy, that in which certain sort of classes of people in the world of the book do different kinds of jobs and experience very much oppressions based on their identities. It's a really useful way of thinking about this topic. I'll also say another thing about that novel is, and people noted this very much with Girl, Woman, Other, is just the sheer skill of the literary craft, at its finest. And we see that through the interweaving of the characters in Girl, Woman, Other in ways that many of us have been rightfully very impressed by. You will also see incredible literary craft in the Fifth Season, in the way that three different characters, I don't want to give it away, I'll say connect. So I recommend this one. Well, I recommend all of these, of course, and many more. And I know you have your recommendations too, which I'm also happy to get. Okay, one last book on the environment. I said Kim Stanley Robinson's New York 2140. So this one is set on Earth in New York in the future, after the sea levels have risen. And I have to say, I would say if Jemison's book is kind of about climate change and race, even though it's about class too, but if we put it that way, we might say that Robinson's book is about climate change and capitalism. And so which also connects to the theme of capitalism in the class. And New York as, financial center is really key to the unfolding of this novel. It's about race too, but I would, if I had to say, I would say maybe 2140 is a little bit more centered on capitalism per se, if that's possible. Okay, but here's what I mostly want to say about that book is the descriptions of the future, as I read them personally, I felt like I was reading our actual future. I thought, this is what it's gonna look like. The story of an iceberg separating, cracks of ice separating from Antarctica, icebergs drifting and melting. In this book, there's certain moments, they're called pulses, where the sea level rises quite quickly over a period of time, and the, devastating consequences that this has. It just felt, it was scary. It was scary because I was reading a work of science fiction that felt like I was reading, as science fiction at its best can do, that I was reading a book about, our actual future. Another point that we mentioned in class about how literature speaks to the past, as history books do, and as historians do. Literature speaks to the present, as historians do. Literature also can speak very powerfully to the future in ways that historians don't always do. Okay, and let me finish by coming back to Leslie Marmon Silko and her book, her 1991 book, Almanac of the Dead, which, it's impossible to think which novel has influenced you the most when there's so many important ones, and I have so many more to read. But can I cross the street? Almanac of the Dead is hard to describe. It's about, I guess it sort of begins with a mystery of a missing child, and the mother of this child is so it's in the present, I guess, of the 1980s, I guess it would be. It's in the present, and this young white woman, Cease, is in San Diego, and her child has been absconded, and she's trying to figure out what happened. And then many other things follow. I won't even try to get into the plot because it's large. It's a large book. It has many characters. And how it influenced me so much is, for many, many reasons. It's an extremely prophetic book. It's been called prophetic in that kind of specifically. It kind of, in sort of mind-blowing ways, it anticipated the Zapatista rebellion of 1994. So it has a kind of direct sort of prophetic element to it, but it seems prophetic to me in so many other ways. In thinking about how the history of colonialism, of settler colonialism in the Americas shapes the past, but also very much the present and into the future in ways that happened after this book was published. The kind of the ways that neoliberal racial capitalism sort of works together with settler colonialism in an ongoing fashion, I think has only become clearer since that book came out, but it was able to see things. Certainly, it's no surprise that I wouldn't have been able to see them, but it sees things that I think few people were able to see necessarily at the time. The ways that, and it also connects to the climate crisis, it connects to possibilities of solidarity, to what people might do in the face of the great interlocking structures of oppression that organize the society of the United States, and in that book, Mexico. It's I guess the geographical center of the book is actually Tucson, Arizona, but it connects to many things. The book has been criticized by some for being unwieldy, and that's kind of true. But to my mind, that's part of the appeal of the book. I think I've read it 3 times. There's no way I could, even if I was given an hour to write down the plot and all the characters, I couldn't do it. And that's sort of part of the appeal of it for me. That doesn't turn me away, because I get something new out of it every time I read it. Anyways, I guess I'm not saying anything in great detail here, but I just want to speak about one book that I'll leave you with that's been a huge influence on me. And I can't really imagine thinking about the history of the United States, my main topic, without, always at some point, in some kind of distance, thinking about Leslie Marmon Silko's Almanac of the Dead, because it touches on many things. And like every book that I've talked about, you know, we obviously, a critical reading is in order as well. And there's things about Silko's book too, other things beyond the supposed unwieldiness of it, that have been leveled as criticisms that I think are worth talking about. So none of this is to say, you know, these books should be read without a critical eye. It's more engaging that we do read them with a critical eye. And so, to come back to my main point, literature is essential for understanding history. Okay, I think I'll leave it there. It's getting awfully windy. I don't know, I don't even know if you can hear me between the cars and the wind at this point. So I'll call it there. Thanks for listening. Thanks for coming with me on this walk, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.